In this video, we're going to have a look at the King's Indian and the Old Indian setups, which in my opinion is a very important topic because many players just play the King's Indian or the Old Indian, the first couple of moves just pre-moving them, and it's a very easy opening for black from this regard. And you will probably face it many times, so this chapter is going to be quite important in my opinion. So after knight f3, in this chapter, we're going to have a look at d6 and knight f6, which go kind of hand in hand. So we're going to start with d6. So black is aiming to build a center with e5. That's why we're playing d4, preventing that. Now knight f6. I also included bishop g4 in this chapter because it kind of makes sense here to include it since it's quite similar to the other lines. But after e4, knight f6, knight c3, black kind of wasted too much time in getting the bishop out, and he just doesn't control the center, like e6, h3, bishop h5, for example, queen e2, preparing g4, and h4, and the black bishop is kind of in a tough spot. For example, here h4, and we're already threatening h5, trapping the bishop on g6, and black is clearly worse here. So knight f6 is the other move, g3, and now knight d7. g6 would be transposing to our main line later. Knight d7, and now knight c3 is quite important. Quite an important detail, because after bishop g2, e5, we wouldn't be in time to build a center with knight c3, e4, since now black is kind of threatening to push forward the pawn to e4, and then if the knight moves, he can consolidate the center with d5. So that's why I like knight c3 here, and the point is that after e5 now, we have e4 immediately, and black doesn't get this option to push forward the pawn to e4 himself. Bishop e7 is kind of the old Indian setup. A g6 would transpose to the line we're going to have a look at later. Bishop e7, bishop g2, castle, castle, c6, and now is a very important moment. With c6, black kind of intends to gain space on the queen side. So that's why a4 is a key move to remember here, preventing black from pushing b5, which if he gets it, he's quite fine in most cases, because if b5 is on the board, he's always threatening to dislocate the knight on c3 with b4, and yeah, we don't want to allow that. So after a4, black mostly plays a5 himself. Otherwise, white often has the option to play a5 and gain even more space on the queen side. For example, one line rook e8, rook e1, bishop f8, and now a5 is what I checked, and yeah, now black's queen side is kind of cramped. For example, rook b8, and there was one more instructive moment here, namely d5, because otherwise if white were to play something slow, for example h3, with rook b8, with his last move, black already kind of declared that he wants to push b5, and here he could do that. For example, b5, probably have to take, and after a b6, again black is kind of intending to go b5, b4, and he has decent counterplay here. So that's why d5 is important, because now black cannot play b5 because the pawn on c6 would be hanging, and if you would take, then e d5, and now white has an important plan, namely knight d2, knight c4, and then maybe bishop e3, and again black's queen side is kind of cramped. He doesn't really have squares for his pieces, and now his counterplay with b5 wouldn't do much good anymore either, because many of these squares are now weakened. But yeah, as I said, knight d2, knight c4 is an important plan, and maybe bishop e3 hitting the pawn on a7, and I think white has the slightly better chances here. Yeah, for example, a5 is another line I wanted to have a look at, just stopping white from going a5 himself. But after rook e1, rook e8, b3, preparing the fianchetto of the bishop. And we could also go to b2 here, but I like bishop a3, just already having a look at the potentially weak pawn on d6. And again, I think white has a very nice advantage here, with quite an easy plan. For example, queen d2, rook d1 looks very natural to me, and yeah. So that concludes the knight f3 d6. Now we're gonna go to the King's Indian, which arises after these moves, and now d4. Black mostly goes d6, and here I recommend rook e1, which is kind of an underestimated move in my opinion. It's not played that often, and it looks quite harmless. But our idea is simply to push e4 and not play like the typical King's Indian setup with c4, which most black players are happy to get, and yeah, we're not that nice to our opponents. And after rook e1, we are kind of the ones surprising our opponent, and we have the upper hand when it comes to this. And here it's just important to kind of have a grasp of the most important plans for white. Yeah, black can first of all, he could go knight e4, just saying, yeah, you want to play e4, you're not allowed, I will just put the knight on e4. But I was not really impressed by this. Like, for example, c3, just overprotecting the pawn on d4 once again, and on the next move we could play something like knight fd2 or knight bd2, exchanging the strong knight on e4, and then later we can build the center with e4. Another move was d5, which is kind of strange because black just played d6 on the last move. White could now go c4 and transpose to the lines, which we will have a look at later, just with the rook being on e1 except for on f1, which is also an option, and I don't think that the rook on e1 is any worse than on f1 simply, but I think that c3 makes more sense. Switching setups now, since after c6, knight d2, the rook makes a lot of sense here on e1, because white intends to push e4 on the next move. For example, bishop f5, knight h4, again preparing this plan of e4. And if black moves the bishop, otherwise we could take e4, take, bishop e4, and this is the typical kind of Caro-Kann structure where white always enjoys a slight advantage. He can develop his pieces very naturally, like the queen maybe to c2, then put out the bishop, maybe f4, connect the rooks, and in these structures often white has a plan to later push h4, h5, which I think is also quite important to know. But yeah, I would be very happy to play such a position. I think white has very nice chances here. Another move is knight c6, intending to meet e4 with e5. But here there's just d5 for white, and black doesn't really have a good square for his knight. Knight e5 would be kind of the move black usually wants to make, but after knight e5, d5, black ruined his pawn structure, and his counterplay on the king side is kind of far away. So that's nothing he wants. The moves I analyzed mostly were knight b4 or knight b8. Let's start with knight b4. Black is hitting the pawn on d5, but we can simply protect it with e4. And if black wants to switch to this King's Indian structure after e5, he can certainly do that, but he just lost way too much time kicking the knight around, and probably black has to go to b8 back, but after bishop b2, we just won so much time, and c4, c5 is coming with very good chances for white. So in most cases we're gonna avoid this type of King's Indian structure, but if black does so many things wrong, then we can kind of live with that and punish him for these inaccuracies. Knight b8 is another move, but here again c4 makes some sense, just preparing knight c3. Here c4 is kind of natural to do it. Otherwise, if you would start with knight c3, then maybe black has plans with b5 or c6 b5, something like this. So here, controlling the center with c4 makes a lot of sense. And if black were to play e5, now I think it's quite important to take on e6. Just not allowing this structure, because compared to the line we just saw, the knight is placed fine here on b8, and yeah, if we weren't to take on e6 here, black would probably be more or less fine. But we are able to take, and after the e6, bishop e6, knight d4, again important, hitting the bishop and the pawn on b7. Bishop c8, knight c3, for example, rook e8, b3, is kind of like the dream position for white in this opening. White just intends bishop b2, queen d2, rook d1, and black has a very hard time developing. Like the bishop on g2 is a monster, controlling the whole diagonal, and I don't really see how black can develop his pieces. Always when he's playing c6, then also the pawn on d6 will be a weakness, which can easily be attacked, as I said, by most like bishop b2, queen d2, rook d1, and then if you move the knight, then already the pawn on d6 would be hanging. So that was knight c6. Another move is c5 here, which is also played quite often, and the idea is that now e4 wouldn't make so much sense, because black would be happy to play this sort of position now, kind of like a dragon, Sicilian type of position, which we don't necessarily want. So yeah, here after c5, dc5 is quite a shocking idea. dc5, black has to take back, and now queen d8, rook d8. It looks like white is playing very, very harmless chess, but the position is actually not so easy for black. The main problem for black is that the pawn is already on c5. If it were on c6 or on c7, there would be nothing happening here. But with the pawn being here, the diagonal is opened, and also the pawn on c5 can be a weakness sometimes. For example, bishop b3 can come, and it's not always so easy to defend this pawn, since after b6, the rook on a8 would just be in trouble quite often. I analyzed c3 here, just blocking the bishop on g7. So that's what I meant before. If black's pawn would be on c6, he would be way happier. Here, knight c6 or bishop e6 are viable options. Bishop e6, I checked knight g5, hitting the bishop and the pawn on b7. And there was kind of a forcing variation here, e4, bishop c6, e5. And after this sequence, take on g5, bishop g5, b6, knight a3. White has a very, very small but stable advantage. There was a nice game. Ulf Andersen played with white, and he won this position, and I think white has some chances in this endgame. It's a very simple plan, mostly knight c4 and then a4, a5. Just hitting this pawn chain, and when I analyzed this endgame, also the computer often showed moves like king f3, g4, just gaining space on the king side, and yeah, even if the engine doesn't show that big of an advantage here, I still think yeah, white is definitely the one pressing here and has good chances. The other move is knight c6, but again bishop e3 hits the pawn on c5, and it's not easy to defend it. Like for example, b6 I guess would run into knight e5, winning the exchange, and knight d7, another logical move. And here I was shocked that after rook d1, rook b8, and the very important knight e1 here, the computer already gave a very, very big advantage, almost a winning advantage. Black's problem is mainly that he just cannot really develop. Like he wants to play b6, bishop b7, then he would be fine, but he's not in time to do that. And our idea is just maybe knight a3. Also knight d3 is important, hitting the pawn on c5, and yeah, black is just clearly worse here. He cannot develop his pieces in time. Another move is c4, but now knight d2, bishop e6, kind of forced to to protect the pawn. But after bishop c6, bc6, knight a3, we gave up our nice bishop on g2, but in exchange we're going to win a pawn, which at least I'm happy for this exchange. And yeah, in this position, black for sure has some compensation, but with being a pawn up on the next move, white is kind of playing for two results here. Now we're gonna jump to the main line, knight bd7, e4, e5, knight c3. So black just wanted to counter e4 with e5, and now it gets this kind of typical King's Indian structure, but mostly in the King's Indian, the pawn is on c4, so it's a bit different, this whole position. And as I said before, my feeling is that many King's Indian players from the black side won't be that familiar with this sort of position. Here I checked 3 moves. Rook e8 was one of them, and as we will see later more, a4 is kind of an automatic move for us in most cases. We just want to win space on the queen side, so black mostly pushes a5 himself. And after h3, e4, knight d4, knight c5, I check bishop f4. White just wants to connect the rooks and then place the rook on d1. Knight h5, bishop e3, and here we're probably forced to play f3, which is not always perfect, but it's also not horrible. White is kind of restricting the bishop on g2, but we're consolidating the center, and black just doesn't have that many squares for his pieces, and we can slowly build up our position like queen d2, rook d1, and this f3 probably doesn't matter so much in the long run, because often we will be able to push f4 anyway, which we often want. For example, we could prepare that with bishop f2 and then f4 when the pawn on e4 is protected. So yeah, I think in this position white also has nice chances. Another option is b6 for black. Now a4, and again we're kind of, our idea is to play a5, so black mostly goes a6 to be able to counter a5 with b5, which we don't want. But here d takes e5 is a nice idea. Otherwise, for example, b3 would be very similar to my recommendation. But here, after ed4, knight d4, bishop b7, black was in time to put the bishop on b7 while taking, and here he kind of has he has quite a lot of pressure on the pawn on e4. So I would rather take on e5 immediately here, not giving him this option. And after d5, b3, bishop b7, knight d2, a very nice motive too, putting the knight to c4, putting pressure on e5. Rook e8, knight c4, knight c5, and now bishop a3. The bishop always is good in this diagonal here, just taking a lot of squares from the black pieces, and currently threatening to ruin black's pawn structure on c5. So black went knight e6 in this game, Svane against Demchenko, and after knight d5, black was under quite a lot of pressure because white's pieces are just perfectly coordinated, and yeah, black's pieces are not. The main move is c6, and here I just want to show one possible variation which could arise. a4. Again, I probably didn't mention it enough, but if black goes c6, then he's kind of intending to push b5 and winning space on the queen side, which we never really want to allow. So a4 is very important. Black mostly goes a5 to avoid white going a5 himself. a5, h3, rook e8, bishop e3, e4, bishop d4, queen c7, and we're following one correspondence game here, knight e5, and there was one nice moment here which I wanted to show. Recently I've been spending a lot of time with space advantages, and you're always kind of saying that the side that has the space advantage should not necessarily exchange pieces, and this is kind of the perfect example for that, since white is the one clearly having at least a small space advantage. He should not exchange these knights here, and that's why knight h2 is a very nice idea here. Not exchanging the knights and preparing to kick out the knight on e5 with f4 on the next move. So I think that was a very, very instructive moment in this game. Black went knight c4, queen c1, queen d8, rook d1, but the knight on c4 looks nice and everything, but at the end of the day he can be kicked out with, for example, b3. So he went back himself, knight b6, and now g4. White is just gaining space on the king side. Black went h5, g5, and in the following position, which was reached in this game, if I were to see this on the board, I would say white is close to winning here. The engine was not that optimistic, but I still think it looks quite horrible, like queen d2, rook d1 is coming. And as a human, you don't really see how black could possibly protect the pawn on d6. So yeah, this was the video about the King's Indian and the Old Indian. I'm quite happy with these setups which I chose, because, as I said, most black players will be surprised by this, and I just think it's important to take away to not allow black to gain space on the king side. For example, here after c6, a4 is always a very important idea, just not allowing b5, otherwise black would get a good game. So this is kind of the key thing to take away in this structure. So thank you for looking at the video, and I will see you in the next lesson. Thank you.